thank you very much, Anteni, for the kind introduction, and also Scott. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here with Pinfa North America to present together with Peter. We have had similar webinars here in Europe, and with this webinar, we want to bring to you an update of what has been happening over the last years in Europe in the field of chemical regulation, and how that impacts flame retardants in particular. So with that, going to the next slide. Yes. A number of years ago, 2019, the European Commission published its Green Deal, and an overview is shown here on this chart. And the Green Deal was a policy announcement that was made by Ursula von der Leyen, the current commissioner, and her team, that has the deal to transform the European economy into a greener environment, and with all these little boxes that you see here, addressing many policy areas and many fields that affect us. And the two that are relevant for chemistry or chemicals are highlighted here with these red dots. So it's one on the left-hand side, mobilizing industry for clean and circular economy. So circularity, recycling is also a big part of those topics. And at the upper right-hand corner, a zero pollution ambition for a toxic-free environment. So also to limit the use of hazardous substances and their emissions to the environment. But also other areas are covered here, like at the bottom, even finances and social aspects, but also farm to fork, food, how that is managed and then handled. So a very broad umbrella of policies, one of which then was the chemical strategy for sustainability, which was also published in 2019. And that announced on a lower level a series of initiatives in the area of chemical regulation, and also not only strict regulation, but also other voluntary measures. If we go to the next slide. But the core of chemical regulation here in Europe is a law called REACH. That means the registration, evaluation, and authorization of chemicals. And that was announced to be overhauled or renewed. And that should have happened last year even, but it was postponed in view of upcoming elections for a new European Parliament and Commission. At the more or less at the last minute, it was postponed, and the Commission and Parliament said we want to leave it to the next Commission to finish this or continue this. And currently, it's unclear when exactly that will happen. But in this context, a number of new ideas were discussed that are quite new to the field of regulation of chemicals. So not only flame retardants, but chemicals in general. And a few are listed here, and that list is not even comprehensive, but to touch upon a few of those. Generic risk approach, what does that mean? It means that restricting substances based on their inherent hazard properties without doing a full risk assessment, so looking at exposure in detail, as we are used to in the area of chemical regulation or assessment, that we look at hazards and exposure of workers or consumers. And only if you have relevant exposure, then there is also a risk. But here, a simplified approach, because this risk assessment procedure used to take quite a long time and a lot of resources. So here, kind of a shortcut to limit chemicals with certain hazards per se in certain applications. Also to reform the concept of authorization and restriction. Authorization is something peculiar under REACH that says chemicals that are identified as really critical and hazardous, that they are going to be phased out over time, and that companies who want to continue to use them have to apply for the option to use them for a limited time, whereas restrictions mean really banning chemicals for certain uses per se, so not by company. So that was to be simplified and streamlined. Also, next point, registration of polymers, some types of polymers, not all polymers, but when you know a little bit about polymer chemistry, there's so much potential, so many potential combinations of monomers that leads to such a huge variety of polymers that when we speak of chemicals, we speak of 10,000s or even more than 100,000 chemicals that need to be registered. In terms of polymers, the numbers can also be excessively high because each new combination of different monomers can lead to, on paper, in theory, to a new polymer. And that brought with it this concept, what's a polymer of concern that might need to be registered? So very complex and difficult subject. Next here, compliance check of all dossiers. That means registration dossiers that the European Chemical Agency has collected on all registered chemicals here in Europe, and to check them in more depth. In the past, most dossiers were not checked, but just accepted and stored at the agency, and it was the obligation of the submitter to make sure that information is complete and correct. But it was not always checked, and there were not even the resources to do a full check. But that is supposed to become stricter, and also with the threat of revoking non-compliant dossiers. So to also put out more stringent penalties in terms of violation of these regulations or insufficient registrations. And last point here, mixture assessment factor relates to the discussion that we are all exposed not to single chemicals, but to many different chemicals. And in toxicology, we traditionally only look at the exposure and the effect of one chemical on the organism and not of mixtures. And there has been a long debate on how that could be handled. And the only practical way is to come up with a factor and say, because there's other chemicals that we are exposed to together with the target chemical, we just apply a safety factor of whatever, 5, 10, and that's been debated for quite a while, to take this mixture effect into account, which is a very rough concept and not very scientifically founded. It's just another safety factor that we also use from toxicology when there's limited data, that in a conservative approach, you apply these safety factors of 10 or 100 to allow for limited knowledge and limited depth of the existing evidence. So if we go to the next slide. Yes. The European Union has also come up with new hazard classes, which currently only valid in Europe, but the European Union has already announced that it's taking these forward to the global level under the globally harmonized system for hazardous chemicals. But for now, it's only in effect as a law in Europe. At the bottom of the slide, you see the detailed reference to the regulation. And it now defines what endocrine disruption means and how that is assessed and measured. Also, a new updated definition of persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic properties. And also the category of very persistent, very bioaccumulative. And then next, a very new concept, mobility, which refers to the ability of chemicals to move in water or in aqueous environments, be groundwater, surface water, rain. Whereas traditionally pollutants, the first pollutants we started to look at, organic pollutants, DDT, pesticides, and the like, were lipophilic substances that tended to move around, and also showed global transport, perhaps by through the vapor phase, through the atmosphere. And now this new class of chemicals that's come under scrutiny has more the property to be somewhat water soluble. And with this water solubility being spread also through the aqueous environment and being found in aqueous environment. And the concern is that chemicals end up in groundwater or surface waters that may also be used for drinking water. And two categories have been defined here: persistent, mobile, and toxic. And very persistent and very mobile, that bring with them new hazard phrases, and they need to be declared, and might also lead to a classification of such substances as substance of very high concern here in Europe. Good. If we go to the next slide. Then early last year, about a year ago, the European Chemicals Agency published this document, around about 70-page document, a regulatory strategy for flame retardants. And if you click once more, we see the LinkedIn post that ECHA then published on LinkedIn. So that's kind of the headline or the first takeaway from this report: certain brominated flame retardants identified as candidates for restriction. And if you click once more, kind of the good message in here is that several phosphorus, inorganic, and nitrogen flame retardants were identified as low hazard and where they see currently no need for regulatory action. But we come to phosphorus flame retardants in somewhat more detail in a minute. If we go to the next slide, here's the timeline that ECHA put in their report. So this graph is taken exactly from their report that says they started preparing a restriction on aromatic brominated flame retardants, which means, for instance, TBBPA derivatives, brominated phenol derivatives or phthalates. So those are in scope here, and prepare a restriction towards the end of 2024 and then carrying over into 2025. And then going forward, that's the green bar there, revision of strategy to review the whole strategy and also look in more depth again in other product categories or flame retardant categories. By now, we have learned that this will be delayed somewhat. So this timeline was quite ambitious when it was published. So it will be delayed by 1 or 2 years, very likely. But ECHA has just received from the Commission a mandate to prepare this restriction on aromatic brominated flame retardants. A call for evidence has been published, which you find under this link here on the ECHA webpage. So that is currently progressing, yeah, on the timeline. If we go to the next, yes, here's a view on the phosphorus flame retardants, because that's of course relevance to PINFA, phosphorus, inorganic, and nitrogen flame retardants. On the left-hand side, you see this table 10 from the ECHA report, which lists around about a dozen groups of phosphorus flame retardants, with the number of flame retardants in the middle column that are within these groups, and on the right-hand side, concerns they have discovered and which they need to or want to study further and elaborate further on. So you see here things like carcinogenicity, PBT, VPVB, or endocrine disruption questions that still need to be resolved, where there's some indication but not clear proof, and that needs to be further resolved with more data gathering together with industry. A CCH, which you see here, very often in the table means compliance check. That means that the authorities ask the producers, we have this suspicion, please comment. Yeah, so that's a regulatory procedure under REACH, this CCH. However, on the right-hand side, you also see some positive messages. On the top there, based on current information, groups of low or unlikely hazards can be identified as those that are mentioned there. And also at the bottom right, that inorganic phosphates, polyphosphates, phosphonates, phosphonates, and phosphorus and its inorganic salts have been assessed with low hazard and no further EU regulatory risk management needed. So some have really been cleared. Always, I think, with a disclaimer for now. Yeah, you never know what may come up in the future, but for now, at least they are kind of out of scope, and ECHA is focusing on more or less on the ones in the table on the left-hand side. And with this topic of grouping, we within PINFA have been dealing quite a lot and also exchanging with ECHA. And in that context, we asked Peter to help us out and tackle this topic of, can you handle groups of chemicals, and in particular phosphorus flame retardants, in terms of toxicity and environmental behavior. And with that, I would like to hand over to Peter with the next slide. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Adrian, and an excellent introduction to the complex world of EU regulation, constantly changing. Following on from what Antoine kindly said about me, so I've been working as a consultant since 1995, and not quite uniquely, but almost uniquely, I've been very well known within industry, but also regulatory agencies at the national level, and including doing projects for ECHA and for the Commission, having previously worked a lot for in the UK, really originally, which was when I first met Adrian, and we produced a widely quoted review of flame retardants in about 2000, I guess. So I've been associated with flame retardants for quite a long time. And under REACH, my former company, Peter Fisk Associates, submitted many hundreds of dossiers for EU companies for REACH. Then I sold the company to the fellow directors, and they've actually changed its name, as stated here. And I've been focusing in the last few years on Green Chemical Design Limited and playing some golf, if the truth be told. So we really, in these days, there is pressure, I think most people would say, to avoid substances with adverse classifications. And that's step one towards achieving sustainability. Next one, please. So Pinfa in Europe was kind enough to ask me to look independently at this topic around the same time as ECHA was thinking about it all, and in particular the organophosphorus flame retardants. Can we scientifically group the chemicals? And there's some pressure to do this, because whilst we, at the time this started, we didn't know what ECHA would conclude, what we also knew is that a lot of publications in the literature where certain groups and authors were putting forward evidence in their view that all of these kind of substances should be considered effectively in one group. And I was asked quite independently to review where we are. Just some personal comment at the bottom there. I think that grouping can save a lot of time. Resources are short in industry and within regulators. So, for example, perfluoro substances can quite arguably be grouped into various subgroups and save us all a lot of time, because there are many, many thousands. And so that's just a personal opinion that grouping can have value. Next one, please. So this is, I think, somewhat derived from the ECHA report, and I'm going to not read it all out, but we've got phosphate esters, phosphonates, and then the others you see here. My focus in the last sort of 2 years looking at this topic was on the phosphate esters and the phosphonates, and I will talk about those. And you can see the kind of breakdown, and some of this breakdown was actually present in the ECHA table that Adrian showed. Next one, please. Sorry, there's a repetition there. 2 repetitions. Now, we're not trying to say that organophosphorus flame retardants do not possess adverse properties. There are some classifications. Different kinds of applications are involved, as well as the different toxicology and different end-of-life scenarios. But with the ECHA approach, they're starting with chemical structures, and ECHA is a science-based organization, and that's where they start. So let's also do that. Next, please. So what I did was collect property data, such as physicochemical properties, environmental properties, degradation data, toxicology of all types, mammalian and in vitro, from REACH dossiers and from published sources where there were gaps. And then I started to look at, is there any basis of grouping based on chemical structure initially, and then do we see groups that are within the properties? Next, please. Now, a very important principle for me is weight of evidence, which I've crudely tried to represent in this diagram. Now, compared to REACH dossiers in general, and as I said, we've written hundreds, and I reviewed on behalf of ECHA quite a large number as well. So I think this statement is based on my own personal experience, extensive evidence that the OPFRs are really quite data rich. So, for example, in the topic of biodegradation, for many of the substances, there won't be just one study, but there might be 8 or 10 different studies from the registrants and from the public literature. And these will be the REACH relevant studies. And in my view, these REACH requirements and worldwide registration requirement studies are very often highly expensive, taking many years to complete, should be given a high amount of weight. And that, not that, so below the line here, there are quite large numbers of published papers using non-standard in vitro methods. And I fully support with absolutely 100.0% commitment that we need these kinds of methods for the future. Otherwise, there will be, we can save time, money, and of course, vertebrates by using well-validated methods. However, what I found was during this work is that quite a lot of these methods that have been developed by individual laboratories, you'll find that one lab gets one sort of pattern of answer and another lab gets a different pattern. And that, for me, is worrying. So in my overall feelings around grouping, I would give weight to the compliance with the heavyweight studies, and since there are so many. Next, please. So I found fairly quickly that you could not put the OPFRs, phosphate esters, phosphonate esters, into a single group. Not only they have different structures, obviously, there are different physical properties, but there are very different toxicological properties across the whole of this kind of phosphorus-based chemistry. Regarding environmental properties, the ecotox, generally speaking, there was a trend with the octanol water partition coefficient, KOW, which is quite normal in organic chemistry in general. So in other words, the higher the log KOW, you tend to see more toxicity up to a limit where the solubility is so low you don't actually can't test them. And then I found that there was different environmental fate properties, although generally speaking, quite a large amount of biodegradation, but not in every case. So I concluded that you can't have, logically, you can't have a single group of these substances. Next, please. So I then started to look at the OPFRs in the groups listed here. And you will recall that some of these groups appeared in that table from the ECHO report. I'm not going to read them all out, but you can see the things I was looking at. Next, please. Now, having said that I see differences in groups, I started to look at going beyond just saying, oh, they've got different structures. But I wanted to see if there was any kind of property or properties that showed the differences. And I am quite an enthusiast for these so-called HSP, Hansen solubility parameters, that have been around in the scientific literature for about 50 years, actually. And sorry for this diversion off into some quite detailed chemistry, but there's these three main properties: dispersion, called delta D, polarity, delta P, and hydrogen bond energy, delta H. And these are energies. They are direct absolute energies. They are not relative numbers. So by contrast, we say the octanol water partition coefficient, which is a relative tendency, octanol versus water. These are absolute strengths of interaction. Next, please. So in this graph, on the x-axis, I've got the delta D dispersion property, and the y-axis is delta P polarity. And you can see that the Hansen numbers pull apart the different structures. And to contextualize this kind of range of delta D and delta P, you could put a very high proportion of the whole world of organic chemistry onto this graph. And anyone's interested in that, I can demonstrate it. But these numbers come from a commercially available program that calculates these things, and you can see the work that the Hansen solubility experts have done. So we're covering a very wide range of energies here, and I've applied this approach to looking at so-called PBT, and you find, and I've semi-published this finding, but almost all of the PBT substances that have been identified by authorities around the world would come in the bottom right-hand corner of this graph. So it's quite an interesting approach. But the point here being that having moved away from structure alone, we see in these fundamental properties there are differences in the energies of interactions. Next, please. So there are fundamental differences in the phosphate esters, but the next graph is also very quickly interesting. Next, please. And so all the phosphate esters here is just shown in blue, the phosphonates in the top left in a kind of orange color, and we see the phosphonates are different as well. And any examination of the toxicology of phosphonates versus phosphate esters, phosphonate esters versus phosphate esters shows would agree that they are not the same. So being a physical chemist by background, I always like it if the physical chemistry says that there are differences that you might expect to see at complex tests. Next, please. So one large group of OGFRs is not good, and I think it's shown well in the HSP approach. And I'm of course pleased that the EU report on flame retardants has recognized that there are differences in these subgroups. And indeed, within the subgroups, you can see quite consistent toxicological profiles, which potentially, I'd be inclined to say that read across between different members is possible. Although, as it happens in this case, as I said at the start, the OPFRs are so data rich that actually there isn't really a need to do any read across even of higher level tests, because there are so much data available. But it could certainly be that a new chemical coming along, you could make a case for some read across. Although ECHA is not always keen on read across, it's still possible. You could make a case to go one substance at a time, but my personal preference, as I just said, is really that the groups have some value. Next, please. So, where do I conclude on the work that I've done for Pinfa? Well, clearly, everything going on in the world of regulation, as Adrian has said, is a key business issue. And as well as performance and cost, the power of the regulatory element we're all familiar with. If we want to understand our groups of chemicals, you will need, and you want to make an approach to authorities in Europe, they are prepared to listen, but you need to be very clear, very strong, evidence-based and science-based. And we see from, as Adrian said right at the start, the move within the EU to being very firm in their understanding of scientific principles, especially hazard, and with socio-economic factors coming in as a second point, and they're even downplaying that, as he explained. So anyone that's interested in grouping in general, really you need to understand what you're saying at the most fundamental level you can. So at that point, I think I'm finished. We'll hand back to Adrian.
Thank you very much, Peter. Yes. Thanks for this in-depth coverage of the grouping. And one topic that you also touched upon was the question of persistence. And that is something we have tried to address here in Europe, and try to illustrate with this graph, which is part of an infographic which we have on our Pinfa Europe website. Because we almost can say persistence for us, it's not a bug, it's a feature, because flame retardants need to be durable chemicals in almost all cases. There were very rare exceptions. Then they need to have some stability, chemical stability, in order to survive the processing, which may happen at elevated temperatures. There may also be contact to water, so hydrolysis might be an issue. And flame retardants are supposed to protect products, as you see here in the middle, be it electronics or even cars, buildings, for many, many years. And over this whole product lifetime, flame retardant has to stick around and not fall apart and not degrade. So that makes it really challenging to have something that protects a product for 10, 20 years, and once it hits the environment, it just falls apart. I have difficulty imagining how that can be done chemically. So the solution to this is to really keep flame retardant products out of the environment by proper collection, by hopefully recycling, having closed loops in the end. And that's something that also Europe is working very much toward, fostering more recycling. We will also need chemical recycling as an option, not only mechanical, because the economics and also the technology of mechanical recycling is really limited. So that's we have been trying to explain to regulators also, that persistence as such should not be seen as an issue, but only in combination with bioaccumulation and toxicity or these other criteria. If we go to the next slide. Yes, another area of concern here, and this goes beyond Europe. So this is, you see here the logo of the United Nations Environment Programme on this left-hand side sheet chart, chemicals of concern in our plastics. The UN Environment Programme has issued a report and a set of infographics that talk about high concerns about additives in plastics, chemicals in plastics, and that in the context of plastic waste, which is being addressed on UN level currently. And they claim, based on a publication from the University of Zurich, that there are 13,000 identified or detected substances found in plastics. And out of those, more than 3,000 are potentially of concern. And those refer to not only flame retardants, which are mentioned here specifically, but also others, yeah, UV stabilizers, metals, phthalates, biocides, perfluorinated substances, whatever. So a couple of thousand chemicals of potential concern. And now the chemical industry is trying to address that on a global scale, so not only Europe. And one idea is to come up with a database. There's this additives database project that is currently run by the International Council of Chemical Associations, which has the idea to collect and also make then publicly available information on which chemicals actually used. Is it really 13,000 or is it only 2,000, which are really in use or which are really relevant? And what are their properties? And that this database then can be searched, and that you can also have a tool to do some screening assessment, as shown here on the right hand side with this graph, some kind of prioritization in terms of exposure, hazard, risk. So that is also work in progress to try to convince the authorities, and in this case the UN Environment Programme, that these additives in plastics are under control, and it's also knowledge is available. And this claim we know nothing about all these chemicals that are used in plastics is not really true, and that chemical industry is willing to supply such information. Good, going to the next. Yes, one new concept here in Europe, and if we go to the next, is that of safe and sustainable by design, a concept brought up in the context of this chemical strategy for sustainability. And the idea behind it is to define criteria how new chemicals should be developed and what criteria should be looked at and studied in detail. And here this list shows all the criteria that contribute to sustainability aspects. Like the first block, the hazards, is what traditionally was in the focus. Things like toxicity, mutagenicity, and now coming into play also endocrine effects, or this mobility I mentioned earlier. Then we have this middle block of life cycle aspects that is rather new or has come up over the last couple of years, including carbon footprint, but not only carbon footprint. It's not everything in that respect, but also other environmental footprint criteria. It's impact along the life cycle, impact on workers, impact on consumers, potentially. The whole question of end of life and recycling, as mentioned earlier, is becoming more and more prominent. And at the bottom, further criteria like are critical raw materials being used for such products or chemicals? What about social impacts? Or for flame retardants in particular, you could also look at what about accidental fires, smoke formation, or smoke toxicity. So a very broad scope, and in their technical report, which the European Commission or their research branch or arm, the Joint Research Center, JRC, has published, they define these criteria more depth and explain what exactly you should and how you should assess these different life cycle stages, what methodologies to use. But this is more like a handbook or textbook of all the things you could do. It's currently not yet an easy to use guideline to do a very quick assessment. So it's very much resource demanding and takes a lot of effort to run through all these processes. But that's something for the future that is also still in development. So this is the first draft of this report and these criteria. Over this year and next year, that is supposed to be refined and revised. and then they will come up with final criteria, which at that stage are only meant for research and development of new, not only flame retardants, but chemicals in general, and not so far not under regulation affecting existing chemicals, but that could also change in future if new criteria here are developed. That may in future also become part of the registration requirements under REACH. So a very important topic to watch, and we within Pinfa, some Pinfa member companies, have also run case studies with this SSPD concept. Going to the next. Yes, we come to our concluding slide, and if you click Debbie, yes, to summarize, a big piece of news was this ECHA flame retardant strategy document that highlights brominated flame retardants, certain brominated flame retardants for regulatory action first, but also looks at phosphorus flame retardants, certain groups and types of them, and in a further step at even others. The REACH revision is delayed, but other work streams under this chemical strategy for sustainability continue, and ECHA is quite active. I just explained the safe and sustainable by design concept, something certainly to watch, maybe also to be taken up in other regions, as said here. And I think last point, if you click once more. Yes, Pinfa, what is our position on all this? Yes, we want to be part of the political and regulatory discussion. We want to provide our input and also support these developments. What I feel is lacking somewhat in this whole chemical strategy for sustainability implementation. The practical part is really promoting safer alternatives rather than defining exactly how to do things and what is sustainable or non-sustainable. Because market acceptance of safer and more sustainable products has been a huge problem in the past, even in cases where there are more sustainable products around, their market acceptance has been limited. And what we hope to gain through this whole exercise and activity is building more trust in flame retardants, which oftentimes don't have a good reputation in the public domain. With that, we come to the final slide. Yes, a quick animation, and yes, here just yeah, you can skip that. Maybe that doesn't matter. Just a little advertisement for our social media channels website. If you want to find more information, you're very welcome to visit us. And with that, I think I'm not at the final end, but here just an overview of Pinfa members. Scott mentioned in the beginning around 40 members worldwide, and here you see them. And I think it's important to mention that Pinfa not only has big flame retardant producers as members, but also smaller companies and flame retardant users, even end users or OEMs like Schneider, who's listed here on this chart. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and ready to take any questions. Thank you very much.